In the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Northern California, time is your enemy. For every hour that ticks by, the odds of survival plummet like a stone in water. After vanishing into a dense, rain-soaked forest, two young sisters, only 5 and 8 years old, were lost for 44 agonizing hours. They had no food besides a few granola bars, no real shelter, and just thin jackets to protect them from near-freezing temperatures. With everything stacked against them, they had to lean on their wits, some limited training, and most importantly, each other, just to stay alive. While a massive search effort raced against the clock, these two little girls put on a masterclass in courage. This is the incredible story of that desperate search, the unbreakable bond of two sisters, and the emotional reunion that brought a family back together in what can only be called a miracle. If you find stories of survival and sisterhood as incredible as I do, show your support by hitting the like button. And for more amazing stories of resilience and the strength of the human spirit, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin with the last afternoon of normal. The Carico family home in Benbow, California, sits on a sprawling 80-acre property. It's the kind of place where the forest is your backyard, a magical playground of towering redwoods and dense huckleberry thickets. For Travis and Misty Carico and their daughters, 8-year-old Leia and 5-year-old Caroline, this wilderness was simply a part of life. They respected it, they enjoyed it, and they understood its power. The girls were bright, adventurous, and incredibly close. Leia, the 8-year-old big sister, was responsible and thoughtful, with a big freckle on her cheek and a protective instinct that went way beyond her years. Caroline, the 5-year-old, was the spirited one, her blonde hair streaked with playful purple. They were country kids, totally at home in the outdoors, and their parents had encouraged that connection. Through family camping trips and, crucially, their local 4-H club, the girls had picked up basic wilderness survival skills. These were lessons taught on sunny afternoons, ideas that seemed abstract, like a fire drill you never really expect to use. No one could have known that this casual training would soon become the most important knowledge they had. Friday, March 1st, 2019, was a dreary, wet day. Rain had cooped the girls up inside, and the house was buzzing with restless energy. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, the sisters went to their mom, Misty, asking to go for a walk to burn off some steam. Misty, busy with chores, told them no, not right now. She told them to wait, but childhood impatience is a powerful thing. The girls decided to go anyway. Leia later said she just wanted a little tiny more adventure, to which Caroline added, "But I wanted more." They knew the rules. Their dad, Travis, had pointed out a fallen tree and specifically warned them never to go past it. It was the line between their familiar world and the true untamed wilderness. But that afternoon, looking for just a bit more adventure, they walked right past it. They started following a deer trail, a path that seemed to promise a quick, exciting loop back home. Back at the house, time moved differently. For Misty, maybe 30 minutes passed before an unnerving quiet settled over the house. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and comfort out of the rooms. The usual sounds of her daughters playing were gone. She stepped outside and called their names. "Leia, Caroline." The only answer was the rustling of damp leaves. She checked the perimeter of the house, then went further, her calls growing more frequent, more urgent. This wasn't like them. A knot of dread started to tighten in her stomach like a vice. She called Travis. She called some neighbors. A small, informal search kicked off, with friends and family spreading out across the property they knew so well. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then 2, the familiar woods started to feel alien and menacing. The sun, already low on a winter afternoon, began to set, casting long, spooky shadows through the trees. The beautiful forest now felt like a monster, big enough to swallow 2 little girls without a trace. Around 6 p.m., with darkness closing in and a cold rain starting to fall, that dread blossomed into full-blown terror. The time for a neighborly search was over. With a shaking hand, Misty Carico dialed 911. Her voice, thick with panic, tried to explain the impossible. Her daughters were gone. They had vanished into the woods. Miles away, deep in the woods, Leia and Caroline were having their own scary realization. The deer trail they'd been following had dissolved into a confusing maze of identical trees. Leia remembered seeing the same metal post more than once. The sickening moment of realization was like a punch to the gut. They had walked in a huge circle. The fun was over. The adventure was gone. All that was left was the cold, creeping fear of being lost. As the last bit of daylight disappeared, the forest transformed. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a threat. Caroline, just 5 years old, started to cry. The fear of bears, mountain lions, and just being alone in the dark was too much. In that moment, 8-year-old Leia made a choice. She wasn't going to panic. She had to be the strong one. "My sister cried the whole night," Leia later said, "so I told her to think happy thoughts of our family." She pushed Caroline to imagine their home. Their parents, fun trips to the beach, anything to fight back the darkness that was closing in. Not just around them, but inside them too. Then, the training kicked in. A voice from her 4-H class, or maybe her dad's on a camping trip, echoed in her head. "If you're lost, stay put. Moving in the dark would only get them more lost." Leia knew they needed shelter, and fast. It was starting to drizzle again. They found a spot under a huckleberry bush, its thick leaves forming a small roof. Then, in a simple, beautiful act of sisterly love, they took Caroline's thin rain jacket and turned it sideways. Each girl put an arm through a sleeve, pulling the small jacket between them like a shared blanket, huddling their small bodies together for warmth as the temperature dropped. Leia stayed awake most of the night, a tiny guard watching over her little sister, listening to the sounds of the forest and her own pounding heart. Meanwhile, the world outside their little shelter was exploding with activity. The 911 call had acted like a flare gun, setting off a massive response. The Humboldt County Sheriff's Office swarmed the Carico property, their flashing lights cutting frantic patterns in the night. Sheriff William Honsel and Lieutenant Mike Fridley started coordinating what would become a huge search and rescue operation. But the conditions were just awful. The terrain was steep, rugged, and slick with mud. The cold, on and off rain made everything worse, chilling searches and threatening to wash away any tracks. For Travis and Misty, these first hours were pure torture. Their home had become a command post, humming with clipped professional voices. It was like being trapped in the calm eye of a hurricane, surrounded by frantic activity, but paralyzed by a terrifying stillness. Every question, what were they wearing? Do they have any food? Was like a fresh stab of pain. Misty confirmed they'd taken some granola bars, a detail that seemed so small then, but would later prove to be a game-changer. The parents could only wait, watching flashlights dance and disappear into the same blackness that held their children. Misty later described the horror of that night. "I wasn't hopeful after the first night, and it being 38 degrees and it pouring rain. I constantly heard my kids screaming for help in my head. Every gust of wind sounded like a cry. Every moment dragged on into an eternity of helpless fear. As the first night wore on, the search grew. Volunteers from the community started showing up, ready to help in any way they could. Over a dozen different agencies would end up joining the effort, from local fire departments to the California National Guard and the U.S. Coast Guard. But in the dark, on that terrain, they were practically blind. The first night ended with nothing. No tracks, no voices, no sign of Leia and Caroline. As dawn got closer, the 12-hour mark passed, a grim milestone in any missing child case. The hope that had fueled the frantic first hours was starting to curdle into a cold, heavy fear. When the sun came up on Saturday, it lit up the true, intimidating scale of the search area. The forest was a dense, nearly impenetrable wall of green and brown. But the search operation had grown overnight. Dozens of trained search and rescue crews with tracking dogs and ATVs fanned out in organized grid patterns. High above, the thumping sound of a Black Hawk helicopter and a U.S. Coast Guard chopper cut through the air, their crews desperately scanning the endless trees for any color that didn't belong, any movement at all. For the searchers on the ground, it was exhausting work. Pushing through the thick brush was like trying to swim through molasses. They scrambled up steep, muddy ravines and called the girls' names until their voices were raw. The tracking dogs occasionally seemed to catch a scent, only to lose it again in the wet, confusing terrain. The mood was urgent and determined, a race against a clock everyone could hear ticking. Then they found something, a small, shiny piece of foil, half buried in the damp earth. It was a granola bar wrapper. Lieutenant Mike Fridley immediately called Misty Carico. We found some granola bar wrappers, and we were able to confirm with the mom that yes, these are granola bars that she's bought in the last few days. It was the first solid piece of evidence they had. For the search team, this discovery was like a lighthouse beam cutting through a dense fog. The wrappers showed us a direction, Fridley explained, from where they started to where the wrappers ended up at. They had a trail. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Hope surged back through the command post. Unaware of the excitement they'd just caused, Leia and Caroline woke up cold, stiff, and hungry. The last of their granola bars were gone, but they were alive, and they were thirsty. This is where Leia's 4-H survival training really saved the day. She remembered a lesson about finding clean water. Drinking from a creek could be dangerous, full of bacteria that could make them sick. But the water that collected on leaves was fresh and clean. She showed her little sister how to carefully tip the big leaves of the huckleberry bushes and drink the cool rainwater. It was a small thing, but it was life-saving. It kept them hydrated and their minds clear. They knew they had to keep moving to try and find their way out. But they also knew they had to be smart. They kept dropping the granola bar wrappers as they went, a trail of breadcrumbs for anyone who might be looking. They heard the helicopters overhead, the sound a tantalizing promise of rescue. They screamed and waved, but the forest was too thick. The choppers were like ships passing in the night, their sound of hope rising and then crashing back down as it faded away. The day was a long, exhausting journey. Their little legs ached. Caroline's bright pink boots and Leia's purple ones, which had seemed so fun, were now heavy with mud. At one point, Caroline was just done. She couldn't walk anymore, her legs too sore. But Leia, always the protector, encouraged her. "I knew they could save us," she later said, "so even though my legs are sore, I kept going." She was the engine of their survival, her willpower acting like a current pulling her little sister along. The bond between them, always strong, was now being forged into something unbreakable. Back at the command post, the wrappers had re-energized the search, but the day dragged on with no more breakthroughs. The boot prints they found were faint, the trail spotty. Every hour that passed without a sighting made the situation more critical. As the light started to fade again, the searchers knew they were facing a second night. For any child to survive one night in these conditions was amazing. To survive, too, was pushing the limits of what seemed possible. As darkness fell for the second time, a heavy gloom settled over everyone. For the more than 250 people now involved in the search, the mood was grim. They had given it their all, and it hadn't been enough. Searchers had to scale back as the light failed. The risk of getting hurt in the treacherous terrain was just too high. A small crew would stay on through the night, but the full-scale search would have to wait for morning. For Travis and Misty Carico, this was the breaking point. The second night was a pit of despair. The glimmer of hope from the granola bar wrappers had been snuffed out, leaving them in a darkness far deeper than the one outside. The what-ifs were unbearable. What if they were hurt? What if they were too cold? Misty's mind replayed her last conversation with her daughters, her telling them no, her being too busy. "I felt awful, terrified and guilty," she would later admit. Their home, once a place of comfort, was now a prison of waiting and worrying. They were surrounded by a community offering food and support, but it was like trying to warm yourself by a distant fire. Nothing could ease the singular pain of not knowing. And deep in the woods, under another huckleberry bush, in what they later called a huckleberry cave, Leia and Caroline were facing their own darkest hour. The cold of the second night felt different. It wasn't just on their skin, It was an invasive chill that seeped deep into their bones, trying to extinguish the very flame of their energy. Their thin jackets felt useless against the damp 45-degree air. They were exhausted, hungry, and their initial burst of resilience was fading. The happy thoughts were harder to find. The fear was more real. Once again they huddled together, sharing that small rain jacket, their bodies pressed together in a desperate attempt to stay warm. Caroline was crying again, her small body shaking from cold and fear. And once again Leah rose to the occasion. She held her sister tight, whispering reassurances, reminding her of their family, their warm beds, their dad who was surely looking for them. She had to believe it herself to make her sister believe it. She stayed awake, listening to the night, every sense on high alert. She was no longer just an 8-year-old girl. She was a guardian, a protector, the keeper of her sister's hope and her own. They had been lost for more than 40 hours. They had survived on a few granola bars and leaf water. They had endured cold rain and terrifying darkness. They had done everything right. But now all they could do was wait and hope that morning would bring rescue, and not just another day of being lost. The 44-hour mark was approaching, a critical window in any search. As the world slept, 2 little girls clung to each other in the wilderness, their survival hanging by the thinnest of threads. Sunday morning broke grey and damp. For the search teams it was now or never. The mood was tense. As Humboldt County Sheriff William Honsel was getting ready to give a press conference, a small team of volunteers from the Piercy Volunteer Fire Department decided to push into a new area, southeast of the main search grid. 2 of those volunteers, Delbert Chumley and Abram Hill, just had a hunch. Around 8:30 a.m., they came across something that made their hearts leap. Fresh, small boot prints. These weren't the faded, rain-washed tracks from yesterday. These were new. They belonged to the girls. With a jolt of adrenaline, they started following the tracks, which led them down toward a creek bed near Richardson Grove State Park. They moved quietly, carefully, their eyes scanning the dense bushes. They started calling out the girls' names. Leah, Caroline. They would call, then stop, listening, straining to hear anything over the sound of their own breathing. They called again, and then they heard it. A tiny voice, faint but clear, calling back. For the rescuers, that small sound cut through the noise of the forest like a bell. We heard crackling, and we thought we heard somebody say, "Dad," Delbert Chumley recalled. And we called their names again, and they said, "We're right here." In that moment, pure joy shot through them. They scrambled through the brush, and there, huddled together under a bush, were 2 little girls. They were looking up, faces smudged with dirt, eyes wide. They were cold, thirsty, but they were alive. The firefighters were almost more excited than the girls were. They just looked at them, casual, as if to say, "Oh, hey." Abram Hill keyed his radio, his voice cracking with emotion as he spoke the 2 words the entire county had been waiting to hear. "We've got 'em!" The call went out at 10:30 a.m., almost exactly 44 hours after the girls had vanished. A wave of cheers erupted at the command post. The press conference was immediately put on hold as Sheriff Honsel got the news. He later stepped in front of the cameras, his voice thick with relief, and made the announcement. "I'm pleased to report that we're all witnessing a miracle today. Caroline and Leah Carrico have been found safe and sound. For the girls, the sight of the firefighters was the end of their ordeal. Leah thought their voices sounded like her dad's, which is why she had the courage to call back. The men gave them water and the warm, dry clothes they had in their packs. They checked them over on the spot. Miraculously, other than being dehydrated and cold, they were uninjured. Getting them out of the woods was still a challenge. The rescuers decided to hike them back to waiting ATVs. A short time later, at a meeting point not far from their home, Travis and Misty Carrico waited, trembling with anticipation. Seeing their daughters emerge from the trees was like the world snapping back into color after 44 hours of agonizing black and white. First, they saw an ATV coming out of the trees, and on it, wrapped in a jacket, was Leah. Travis ran forward sobbing and swept his daughter into his arms. Moments later, a second ATV appeared, carrying Caroline. Misty rushed to her, pulling her into a fierce hug, tears of pure joy streaming down her face. The family was whole again. In a video of the reunion, you can hear the parents' raw emotion, kissing their daughters and wrapping them in their own jackets, the nightmare finally over. Leia and Caroline were taken to a local hospital where they were found to be in remarkably good health, a testament to their incredible resilience. The story of their survival quickly went viral, a beacon of good news that captivated the nation. It was a story with many heroes, the more than 250 people from over 20 different agencies who never gave up the search. The volunteers like Delbert Chumley and Abram Hill, whose hunch led them to the right place at the right time. And the community of Benbow that wrapped its arms around a family in crisis. But the true heroes of this story are, without a doubt, Leia and Caroline Carrico. When faced with a terrifying life-or-death situation, they didn't give in to fear. Instead, they relied on their training, their ingenuity, and their deep love for one another. They knew to stay put. They found clean water from huckleberry leaves, and they huddled together for warmth, sharing a single rain jacket. At the heart of it all was the incredible bond between two sisters. It was 8-year-old Leia, comforting her 5-year-old sister, telling her to think happy thoughts, and standing guard through 2 long, dark nights. And it was Caroline, trusting her big sister, following her lead even when her legs ached and she was terrified. Their mother, Misty, said it best. They saved each other. I'm the proud mom. I raised superheroes. The rescue was rightly called a miracle by Sheriff William Honsel. It was a miracle of timing, community effort, and sheer luck. But it was also a powerful reminder of how important basic survival knowledge is. That 4-H training, those lessons from family camping trips, made the difference between life and death. It just goes to show that even a little bit of knowledge can be a powerful tool when you're facing the unknown. Ultimately, the story of the Carrico sisters is a profound reminder of the strength of the human spirit, the power of community, and the simple, unbreakable bond of family that can guide you through the darkest woods and bring you safely home.